All right, so our panel today here is a bit of a different group than some of our other panels. We're not necessarily concentrating on a sport itself, but I thought this was an interesting group to get together uh, where we have people that have found a niche in sports analytics and have found a career in sports analytics and aren't necessarily working directly for a team or a media outlet like most of our other panelists today. So um, our our group that we have with us, we have Greg Strizek uh, acting as Alex Strizek today, um, Meghan Chayka from Stathletes, and Justin Kubatko from StatMuse. So I'm just going to go ahead and move as left to right as you guys appear on my screen here. And Greg's the first one that I see up. Greg, can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
So I work with a group of analysts, and we provide analytics support to all of Ford Motorsports NASCAR teams. And the NASCAR world's a bit of a different model in that you have 40 competitors on the track, but each of those cars may be a single team, or there may be up to 4 cars supported by the same organization, like Team Penske, Roush Fenway, and then the clusters of cars that race under one of the 3 manufacturers also get support, common support from those manufacturers. So we get paid by Ford Motorsports, or Ford Performance, I'm sorry. We support 4 to 5 organizations, but 12 to 14 cars. So, and our initial work started around decision-making. And it was the director of motorsports for Dodge back then said, you know, we have mountains of data and no information. We're spending $75 million a year, and I watch the same guys make the same mistakes every time. He's like, there's got to be a better way. And coincidentally, it was the year that Moneyball came out. So Chip Ganassi asked the manufacturer to bring in smart people who don't know anything about racing. So it was kind of a fresh perspective. And we, as naive, non-racing people, tried to identify decision points, tried to identify, you know, where they might challenge conventional wisdom successfully. And also, it's a sport currently dominated by engineers who are really smart people. I will say there are more PhDs and master's degrees in the infield of a NASCAR race than there are on the sidelines of any other major sporting event. Not even close. So really smart people, but they're hard scientists who are used to things being black and white. The coefficient of friction holds until it doesn't. When it comes to strategy in a race, you're dealing with uncertainty and probability. And so they don't always handle that so well. So we've tried to build a suite of tools to help them initially with in-race decision-making. It's evolved to post-race performance evaluation and a lot of other things. And I'm sorry if that was a bit long-winded.
All right. Thanks, Greg. If I look like I'm looking off to the side here, it's because I'm replying to the emails of people that can't figure out how to get into this room. So Meghan is a co-founder of Stathletes. You guys do some hockey analytics there. Can you tell us a little bit about what you guys do?
Yeah, I mean, that was a great intro, Alex. And I feel like that's probably a lot of our stories is realizing that there's gaps in the market, seeing the value proposition. And I think what a lot of people don't understand about sports is it's not like the problems that we're solving here are that much more different than any other industry. So even before I worked in sports, you know, I was with a Fortune 500 company in analytics. I was with the federal government, as well as an airline at one point. So I had a lot of experience in like enterprise type data and analytics and what like $37 billion top line companies did for solutions. So I think when you have that knowledge, bringing it into sports and solving these like complex problems, especially hockey, I mean, it's a very dynamic sport. There's a lot of issues when you have white jerseys on white ice with little tiny pucks and a lot of occlusion, and you know, you can't see people a lot of the time. So solving those complex problems, I think, is something that, you know, is really interesting for sports fans. And whether you're from engineering or computer science or straight data science, I'm not sure what the mix is in this room, but I feel like there's space for a lot of people and a lot of tech companies to disrupt sort of the old school mentality. So we started our company actually before the Moneyball movie came out. So thank goodness in 2011, it was much easier to explain what we were after. But, you know, we always saw that gap of bringing more information, better, faster, more accurate to decision makers and also to fans to engage in the sport. So the interesting thing about hockey is it's a very international sport. So we work in 22 leagues collecting data, you know, have a presence in Europe and do a lot of work that, you know, spans a lot more than North America. So I've even got to go to the Olympics and work for our broadcasters on the women's and men's tournament in Pyeongchang and all sorts of fun projects all over the world. So, you know, really interested to hear what the other companies have, you know, their experiences, but definitely I think, you know, people that are looking for jobs in sports, you don't just have to work for an organization. There's a lot of interesting companies that are doing great things.
Great, thanks, Megan. Justin, can you tell us a little bit about StatMuse? Justin's the Chief Data Officer of StatMuse.
Yeah, that's just a fancy way of saying I'm in charge of our databases. Yeah, so StatMuse is a company that does natural language processing, but focuses on sports. So for example, you could submit a question via text or via voice. We take that question, interpret it into a query that a database can understand, get the answer, and then return it to the user in natural language. And the reason we decided to focus on sports was with things like Siri or Alexa, you can ask sports questions, but you can only go sort of shallow, whereas we thought it'd be better to focus on sports and go as deep as possible with that, with those types of questions. So that's what I'm currently doing. In what seems like a previous life, I created the website basketballreference.com and served as vice president for its parent company, Sports Reference. And I've also consulted with the Portland Trail Blazers and with the NBA Stats and Technology Group.
Great, thanks, Justin. You know, Megan touched on this a little bit, but sort of the path. I know Greg pretty well, and I find his path is kind of interesting that you went from, Greg has a PhD in political science from Ohio State, and now he does NASCAR data. Can you tell us a little bit about how that transition happened, how you wound up where you're at now?
Yeah. Let me unmute, and to clarify, Alex Strizek, and my name is Greg. It says Alex because apparently my teenage daughter co-opted my computer at some point. So, so getting back to 2003, the director of motorsports for Dodge decided they needed to do something Moneyball-esque, was how they pitched it. And so they solicited proposals from 3 groups. And when you want to talk about serendipity and being in the right place at the right time, my grad school roommate's college roommate was an Air Force pilot who did a flyover at the Daytona 500 in 2003, struck up a relationship with the director of motorsports. And this guy called the pilot, who's now a general, and said, you know, we need smart people. Racing is like war, in the context of you bring all kinds of plans to the track. And once it starts, when things happen, all bets are off, and you just need to figure out how to react and deal with the uncertainty and manage it. And so they interviewed 3 teams, one from Rand, one from a university in the Northeast, and us. And us means me, an old roommate, a friend who worked at the Pentagon, who's an econ PhD and another operations research guy. And they decided, I don't know that they decided we were the smartest or had the best skills, but they also realized that at the time there was one college educated driver, and crew chiefs and team engineers were largely not from education background at that point. There weren't as many formal engineers or PhDs. And they felt like we were best equipped to give smart answers, but to be able to actually deliver the product to those clients. And so we did that on a consulting basis. You know, I held a full-time position at a research organization. And then after 5 years, the consulting was ending up being more work and more rewarding, both kind of emotionally, but also financially. And so then I left and started a company, and that's how we've sort of transitioned for the, and so, you know, I like to say we're in the 17th year of a 1-year contract.
Thanks. Megan, you did share a little bit about your background and how you got into Stathletes. Do you think you can expand on that a little bit and kind of tell us
Yeah,
how Stathletes started?
sure. And I think for a lot of the students in here, it's a really great time to try to start companies when you're actually in school because you do have a lot of resources. There's people, that are great entrepreneurs. I know I have a position at the University of Toronto as a data scientist in residence, and we have a group called the Creative Destruction Lab, and they have, 10 different universities across the world that look to scale tech companies. So I would say probably my best advice, if I could like look back on when I started, was to look outside sports for like tech people that are scaling data companies and use like their frameworks and learn from them because as much as sports is about relationships and can be small and very niche, I think that we can learn a lot from outside of sports, and some companies make the mistake of just trying to like learn and make mistakes as they go versus actually just like leaning on some of these experts who have been there, done that. They know that how to go sell, they know how to scale. So, a lot of what I do is actually in tech and not as much in sports. And I'm, with a lot of groups in Canada, both at the federal level and at the provincial level to help scale tech companies. And we have, great resources as well. We've really heavily funded that sector as, where we're getting jobs and how we're growing, especially around the Toronto area. So I'm fortunate to be here. And I'd say that has been my journey for the last 5 years, is just like digging in and trying to be a better entrepreneur every day.
All right, Justin, can you fill us in a little bit more on your background? I think that you did get a statistics degree from Ohio State, I believe.
Yeah, I kind of had a long and interesting road into the world of sports because when I was younger, my dream was actually to be a math teacher and a basketball coach. And so my bachelor's degree was in mathematics, and then I got certified in education. So my first job was actually as a math teacher and head JV basketball coach at a high school in North Carolina. And then partway through my first year, I realized I did not have the temperament to be a high school teacher. And I couldn't see myself doing that for the next 30 plus years. So that was sort of the thing that compelled me to look at graduate school. And that's what led me to Ohio State. And, after I left Ohio State, I kind of bounced around. Once again, it was never really my plan to end up in sports. So I was at various times, I was a direct marketing analyst. I was a biostatistician. I was a college lecturer in statistics. And so I started, I created the website basketballreference.com sort of just because the website baseballreference.com had come out. This is like the late 90s, early 2000s. And I thought, well, it'd be really cool if we had something like this for the NBA. And it was just a hobby, and I was doing it in my spare time. And it kind of turned into something that I wasn't expecting. It got very popular. Traffic really increased. It got to the point where I could make that my full-time job, which was like a dream come true. Turning a hobby into a full-time job was just something amazing for me. And I think back to when I was a little kid, and I've always loved sports. And I remember as a kid collecting baseball cards and looking at the numbers on the back of the cards and whatnot. And, I can just think like going back and telling that kid that one day you'll make money, playing with sports data, I would have really impressed my younger self, I think. So the opportunity at Sports Reference led to some opportunities in the world of sports, like with the Trailblazers and with the NBA. And, I think it also helped me obviously get my current job with StatMuse. So it's, you don't necessarily always plan to end up where you are, but I'm glad I'm where I am right now. And I think all those different jobs I had along the way, they played a part in helping me become the sort of employee that I am today.
Great, Justin, as you're talking there about the development of Basketball Reference, got me looking down at my list. It's something I wanted to ask later on, but I'm going to go ahead and push it now. Is as that's coming together, most of our guests here are students, and they're used to just you just go to Basketball Reference or Pro Football Reference or whatever sports reference page, and you just download the Excel sheet, and now you've got data. So how did that get there? I mean, did you guys have people sitting in an office watching ABA games from the 70s or You know, how does this data get assembled?
No, we did not have that. I wish I would have. No, so I started it by myself. I was the only person working on the site for years. So this was sort of, you know, back when the internet was not nearly as ubiquitous, and so I learned how to do some basic web scraping, and I could get data for current players and current teams from the internet by scraping, but historical data was hard to come by, and so a lot of looking back at old NBA guides that the Sporting News used to publish and manually entering things. When the site first released, I was missing some data, and I would have people write in and offer, you know, stuff that they had collected over the years to me. Yeah, and so it was a lot of just you know, crowdsourcing, manual entry, just really tedious type work. But you know, I wanted to have a reference that was as comprehensive as possible, and so you know, I did the work to get all that done. But you know, eventually it got to the point where there started to be more and more companies that were offering data feeds that you could subscribe to, you know, APIs that you could plug into to get data. And so that's how I kept it up to date then going forward from a certain point was, you know, writing scripts to retrieve data from companies that I licensed the data from, that sort of thing. And so over the years, the amount of data that I have to enter by hand has gone way down. And the data processing that I can, you know, just sort of push a button and everything runs, that's really the way things are done now.
All right, so Greg, so the NASCAR data that you guys get, and how does that take place? How is that assembled?
So it's actually, it's an interesting, I think, microcosm of the evolution of data in sports, because when I started several years ago, as you can see by the gray in my beard, the only information NASCAR provided the teams was the time it took each car to go around the track. So if it took 31.246 seconds for one car to go around the track, for that lap of the race, that was the only piece of information you received. So we're being asked to kind of figure out how to make decisions, and we're realizing that we have to start, you know, figuring out how to observe, measure, develop data that didn't exist or wasn't provided to the teams. And it's evolved to the point now where NASCAR provides to the teams real-time telemetry, and it's like 5 megahertz, so 5 observations per second, and they're getting throttle tracing, brakes, GPS location of the car on the track, engine fuel injector mapping, et cetera. So we've gone from literally getting, you know, a couple hundred observations per race to terabytes of data per race. And so, so that's, I mean, I think that's akin to what Meghan's done in hockey, is managing sort of that complex, complicated data and figuring out how to distill it down into discrete events or units of analysis that answer questions that are important to the teams. But also, one of the things we did when there was virtually no data was we started developing and creating some of our own measures and metrics. And we developed something probably, you know, in our 3rd or 4th year that is still, you know, NASCAR is a small sport. There's 3 manufacturers and really 10 major teams. And the professionals move from team to team like any sports league. And we've been told that we have the best measures of things that other organizations aren't measuring, that are most predictive of success in making it to the playoffs and in, you know, being successful in the playoffs. And so it comes down to what's available. There's much more available to the professional organizations from the leagues. What's publicly available, but like, you know, NASCAR never had, you know, scorecards or box scores. So it really was a combination of developing, creating, and now managing the fire hose of telemetry data.
All right. So I was going to ask, oh, I'll come back to the questions later. But Meghan, so you've got a pretty big online presence in the sort of sports analytics community. And over the COVID break there, you put together quite a big publicly available conference in your hockey analytics night in Canada. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about sort of the role of this this online community and Twitter community and stuff in sports analytics.
Yeah, I think whenever you're starting a tech company too, there's a huge allocation towards marketing. So they always call it like cost of customer acquisition. And typically like you're buying sport techie articles or you're putting stuff out there. And I just never want to be that person. I want to be very authentic. So I thought that this was one way to do marketing and in a way that helps everyone, right? Because the more we understand about how to use data in sports, the more our market grows. So I mean, I even had 2 full women in baseball events. So like almost 4 hours of women in baseball talking about analytics, sports science, all the technical roles that women are fulfilling on and off the field. And today now we have the first woman GM. So, you know, it's really cool to see people advance and people get more exposure that maybe wouldn't, you know, 10, 20 years ago because they weren't in sort of the old boys or conservative network. But you know, have the skill set and are able to, you know, provide a lot of value to these organizations. So part of it was like a self-serving, you know, tech play, but the other side of it was I just love connecting with people in the industry that were bright, pushing things ahead, and I think we can all learn from each other. So unselfishly, it was an awesome opportunity, and even hosting things like this where, you know, we can speak directly to students and hear from other companies that are in similar spaces as me, I find very valuable. So I would say for students, like, I feel like they think they get the role and, you know, the hard work is done. I think the hard work just starts when you get the role or when you're a co-founder or when you're a boss, because I can tell you managing, you know, 50 people is much harder than managing 5, and it just keeps escalating. So I don't think it gets easier, you just get better.
Great, thanks, Megan. Sorry, I was getting a little distracted here, but Justin, I was going to ask you a little bit about the your work with the Trailblazers and kind of how that came up. And if I'm correct, you worked as a consultant rather than directly with the team, and maybe a little bit about how that might be different.
Sure. Yeah. So it came about basically because of basketballreference.com. It wasn't a position I applied for. Someone at the team had reached out to me and, you know, say, hey, we really like your website. We like what you do with it. We would like somebody who internally can do some of this stuff for us. And so I said, yeah, that sounds really good. And, you know, I don't really have a desire to move to Portland, not because I don't like Portland, just didn't want to move. We were settled in Columbus. And, you know, and I want to keep my job with Sports Reference. Like I don't want to just, you know, solely work for a team. And they're like, oh, that's fine. We don't want somebody full-time. We want somebody part-time. And so that's all that started. I had you know, basically a yearly contract with them that gave them a certain number of hours of consulting per month. And, you know, this was sort of in the infancy of basketball analytics. And so they really had nobody on staff who was doing that sort of thing at the time. They didn't really have any nice data systems set up. I remember going out to Portland to visit them just to talk about the role. And, you know, they showed me this binder that they had where it had like player statistics and scouting notes and that sort of thing. But it was the kind of thing where, you know, this thing gets printed and then a month later, it's completely out of date, right? It doesn't have the most complete information. And so one of the things I did early on for them was I built an internal website that they could use where we could track these various statistics and measurements that they're interested in. We could add scouting reports that you could query, that sort of thing, because, you know, the scouts really didn't have access to the reports that other scouts were submitting. You know, it was all paper-based and that sort of thing, or email-based. And really, so my role at first was to do that, just to get up a system in place where they could, you know, have easy access to information. And then after that, it was not really so much me working with what's going on the court. It was more in the front office. So I wouldn't be communicating with the coaches. I think you should try this. I think, the numbers say you should do this, that sort of thing. It was more like, hey, here's a player we're interested in acquiring. What do you think about his fit with the team? And fit meaning statistical fit. So what they would do is they would rely on the scouts, obviously, to use their eyes to determine whether or not this player is a style fit for the team, right? And they would use what they heard about the player around the league to determine whether or not this is a player that would fit into their culture. And they said, we want you to focus solely on the numbers and let us know statistically, what are this guy's strengths? What are his weaknesses? That sort of thing. Is he a good statistical fit for the team in terms of, what does the team need? And so it was a lot of just, here's a bunch of guys we're interested in, write us a report and get back to us. So a lot of that early on. So again, it wasn't really me doing X's and O's type work. It was more like, front office consultation and telling them, yeah, I like this guy. No, I don't like this guy. And here's why.
All right. So Greg, we hear a lot about in some other sports about how analytics has changed baseball and basketball, for example, are the ones that get talked about the most in terms of like the shift and shooting threes and how analytics have fundamentally changed the game. Is there anything like that in NASCAR that you see?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say, and as I alluded to a couple of years ago, NASCAR started releasing this telemetry data. And teams are getting that on streamed during the race. And what you've seen, and if anyone on here is a NASCAR fan, you'll know that in several broadcasts this year, they showed the Richard Childress Racing, their war room. And they have a consulting company that provides them with real-time, machine learning modeling of, like, one of the biggest decisions you'll have at many tracks is when a caution comes out, you have the opportunity to pit, and it's more advantageous to pit under caution than under a green flag. And when you pit, do you take fuel only, 2 tires or 4 tires? And so you now have this streaming data to model tire wear and fuel consumption. And so there's some discussion as to how successful and accurate that can be. And so, it's evolved to much more of an F1-like condition. On the other hand, you don't get all of the variables. You know the data you get, but what you don't realize is when you're observing a car, the first car in a line has 200 to 400 pounds more downforce than the 10th car, and maybe 150 to 250. So I guess what I'm getting at is one of the dangers, and you're going to see this in all the sports with telemetry and tracking data, is more data isn't always better data. If you're not able to measure the aerodynamic impact, and if you don't know, you have your one car and there's 39 other cars, and you don't know any of their technical setups, or in a sport where a 1/4 pound of air in one tire versus the other can make a huge performance difference, there's a lot of data. There's a lot of people thinking they know a lot of things. And so it's progressed, and there are people who think they know a lot, but there really is the danger. In our sport, a crew chief makes 4 to 5 decisions, maybe 2 to 3 really hard, impactful decisions during a race. He has to make them in often less than 30 seconds. And so, this fire hose of data and identifying and modeling the correct data and knowing that you're not missing all sorts of unknown variables, et cetera, is really sort of it's a complex and complicated situation that people think they're doing a lot better, but, who knows?
All right, thanks. Meghan, I've seen you in the last couple of years present at the Blue Jackets Analytics Conference at Sloan a couple of times. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that actively producing research sort of plays in your position there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I think it's a bit challenging sometimes as a company because you have constraints on like time and resources and also on what you can share. So that's kind of the unfortunate time is like you may have a really great breakthrough or something that, you know, you wish you can publish, but it takes you 10 years to get it out. And that's just because of contracts and NDAs that you signed and different things that you do to like advance your company. And I mean, that happens in every industry, right? If a certain egg company makes a breakthrough, they're not sharing it with Kubota, let's say, right? So, you know, it's just business. And I feel like that's the one challenge. And sometimes at these conferences, people complain because, you know, you get top executives and no one will really say anything. They'll say, oh, sorry, I can't answer that question, but I can talk about, you know, my career trajectory or something that, you know, is not as valuable. So I think it's really fun when you're able to talk about research in that way. I know I did like odd man rushes and, you know, trying to get another paper in MIT this year. So excited to do a bit more. And that was kind of a bit of the part of doing like Hockey Analytics Night in Canada, is to, you know, kind of peel back the layers a bit on what data science actually is and how many different you know, avenues there are of it. You don't just have to have a PhD in stats. There are people in engineering. There are people in, you know, computer science. It's a wide variety of different people that go into making these companies and are in these departments and roles. And some come from even like non-traditional, because, you know, self-learning now and being a coder, you don't necessarily have to have even a university degree to be effective. So I think, yeah, the more research you can do, the more you can collaborate with people. You just push forward not only the sector, but also yourself. And I think, you know, I've made a lot of great connections that are long lasting, both in my career and in my personal life, to be honest. Sports is a really great community as well. So if you can attend and you can participate in any way, if you're a student, you know, sign up for the pitches or the hackathons or the case competitions. Don't worry that you're not ready. Worry that you're not in there. You know, just get in the room, start working on it. So I think, you know, you're all doing a great thing today, being here and showing up. So, you know, take the next step in your student career as well.
Can I chime in and say that Meghan is underselling her last presentation at Sloan was, and again, I've been going to Sloan, I think 9 of the last 10 years or something like that. And I, you know, from the time it was hundreds to now it's like, I don't know, 2,500, 4,000. And it's always good storytelling. And you love to hear Mark Cuban or, you know, someone like that tell stories, but it's often, yeah, we can't really tell you what we're doing, or we don't. And the paper that she alluded to was really interesting. And I think what's interesting is, you know, is it odd man rushes? And, but again, it highlights how complex it is, because like in the first 30 seconds, it's like, how do you define an odd man rush in hockey and then code and quantify that? And it's like an odd man rush was an odd man rush shot was within 4 seconds of a controlled entrance where the puck doesn't go below the goal. So right off the bat, you're taking the fluid hockey, you know, an incredibly dynamic sport, and you're creating discrete units of analysis that then become comparable, and you're then allowed to analyze shots from like situations. And for those of you, you know, who haven't gone through that sort of measurement units of analysis, Dean Oliver, who's, you know, some would say is the Bill James of basketball, wrote a book, Basketball on Paper. And what he did was developed a unit of analysis, you know, where it was by possession, where he identified every touch, every pass, every dribble. And it really was like, because a lot of what this goes down to is, I mean, you require smart and clever people to be successful, but it doesn't mean that you have to be a computer science PhD. It's not necessarily the technical skills, it's the problem solving. And what we found in working with our clients in NASCAR is it's asking the right question. And we used to go to them and say, what do you want us to work on? And then it evolved to the point where, you know, one of our clients who's worked with us when we were with Dodge and is now with Ford and is the director of competition for Team Penske, said, we would say, look, what do you guys want us to work on this year? And he said, look, Greg, we're overcome by events. You know, NASCAR is the longest season in sports. It starts in the middle of February. It ends at the end of November. They've got 36 points events, 4 exhibition events. He said, look, once the season starts, we can't think. He's like, just do what the smart people think we should do. And he would say, you guys are smart and you have time to think and you develop stuff and we'll tell you if it's useful or not. And they rarely say it's not, but getting back to Meghan, it comes down to creative and clever ways to create units of analysis and then measures that don't exist. And I'm sure, like, I have not seen the, you know, the odd man rush and the rush shots before, but it just takes a lot of, it's a lot of work to code all of that.
No, I appreciate it. That's way better put than I could have. So thanks, Greg.
And just to add to that too, like Greg was mentioning, like, you know, it's really important to know the right questions to ask. If you're clever enough to know the right questions to ask, you're clever enough to pick up the, you know, using a database on your own or figuring out how to code on your own. So yeah, don't let those things be obstacles. You know, if you don't know how to use a database, figure out how to use one. MySQL's free. You can go download it and use it on your own computer. You know, if you don't know how to code, use Python or Perl or something that's free. You can do that at home on your own computer, you know, those sorts of things. So just because you haven't been formally educated in those areas doesn't mean you shouldn't attempt to try those things.
To echo that comment, remember, my entire career right now is based upon the fact, and I like to say, I got hired because I knew nothing about racing. And so there really is value in having a fresh set of eyes. And we had a retired crew chief who was a director of competition who we were able to work with. And we would go to a race and we would sit next to him and we would just ask, when everything happened, we'd like, why this, not that? Why do you decide this now? And what's going on? And a lot like, and I like to think about sports analytics taking people beyond conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom is conventional wisdom because it often works. But as I alluded to in NASCAR, you typically have 3 to 4 key decisions. And the problem is that makes them really high stakes decision, really high visibility on TV with your boss, your manufacturer, and all your fans watching. So what do? The safe bet is if you follow the conventional wisdom and things work out, you know, that's great. If you follow conventional, the next best outcome is following conventional wisdom and things don't work out. And it's like, well, what else could you do? That's what everybody does. You know, you never make the first out at third base. You never, like, baseball is the king of conventional wisdom. But then you have, you know, the third best outcome is you don't follow conventional wisdom and you're successful, but you don't really get credit for that decision. It's like, oh, that was lucky. I don't know what they were thinking, but boy, it worked out for them. But in NASCAR, when we came into the sport, the worst decision was you didn't follow conventional wisdom and it didn't work out. And then you were just stupid. And that's how crew chiefs lost their jobs. And so we had to convince the manufacturers and the teams, and, you know, by showing them the decision points and the probabilities of the various outcomes, that there were times where you couldn't do the same thing as everyone else and expect to be successful. And Dodge left the sport in 2012. And so we were interviewing with the other manufacturers to transition to another manufacturer. And Brad Keselowski won the championship that year. And we were interviewing with one of the other manufacturers, director of motorsports. And this was in September. So the season hadn't ended. And he said, if I never hear the number 2 car is going off strategy again, it will be too soon. And that was Team Penske. They had a really progressive crew chief and race engineer, and they were looking at the probabilities and they were playing the long game, and they consistently had better results. It didn't always work, but they were often off strategy and it often worked out. And so that's kind of the role we have to play, is to convince people when the data can inform their decisions. And it can't always, but often, you know, conventional wisdom is mostly right, but it's not always right. And figuring out when you can provide information to let them decide when to make the choice to bucket.
All right. Just a heads up, Megan, I'm going to use your saying there from now on in my classes. Don't worry that you're not ready, worry that you're not there. I like that. So my next question, I wanted to go to Justin, and Justin's worked, you know, providing, for example, with the Trailblazers, and then also providing statistics to a public audience, which I think is a little bit different, where you want to try to make things a little bit more consumable. I think StatMuse does a really good job of that. I was playing around with it earlier, but can you talk to us a little bit about kind of like where you want that level of like statistical rigor to hit this public audience that's looking for these products like Basketball Reference and StatMuse and these public websites?
I'm not sure I understand. Could you maybe rephrase, like, what do you mean by statistical rigor?
Well, I just mean, so you want to make this more easier to consume. Like the StatMuse site is pretty easy to consume, for example, and just how that differs from a product where you want maybe a team or some organization to use this to try to make themselves better in some way versus some entertainment kind of thing that we're looking at it like a basketball reference or StatMuse.
Right. Yeah. So I think someone coming to StatMuse, for example, is probably more interested in trivia than they are, data that would lead to better decision making on the court, for example, that sort of thing. Like we don't handle those types of questions. We can't answer questions like, how often do the Rockets shoot a 3-pointer and when down 5 points? Whatever. We don't do those sorts of things. And so the thing is with us is because we are sort of then focused on answering these trivia type questions, we want to make sure that we have obviously deep historical data for the sports that we cover. It doesn't do any good to have data that's not complete. We want to be able to process as many of those questions as we can. Obviously, there's a limit, right? With natural language processing, you can try to hit as many popular questions as you can, but ultimately someone's always going to stump the system, right? And come up with a question that you're just not capable of understanding. And so we're constantly reevaluating, okay, is this the type of question we should be able to handle? Do we have the data available to answer that sort of question and so on? And and so like just going back to things that Megan and Greg were saying earlier, like their jobs are kind of more like they have to keep what they do behind a curtain. And whereas in my jobs, it's like, I want to get this data, this information out to as many people as possible. And, it's just, that was one of the reasons I was never really interested in working directly for a team full time, is because I do like sharing that information and not having to keep it all to myself or with a small group. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just, personally, the decisions I've made have led me to jobs where it's like, okay, I get to share everything I'm working on. And so it'd be a difficult transition for me to then go to a place where, okay, you can work on this stuff, but you can only maybe share it with 3 or 4 people.
All right.
The trade-off, Justin, is you don't get a championship ring.
All right, so we're going to start fielding some audience questions here. We have a question from Ashley to Megan. She's a fellow female entrepreneur and creating an emerging sports data and performance analytics platform for New Zealand rugby, which sounds exciting. She wondered if you have any suggestions for practicing and refining her pitch for hackathons.
Interesting. Actually, I did a conference for the Irish rugby group. So they are, ravenous for more data. So I think you're in a good space in terms of, having a worldwide, very big market. I would say just pitch early. Anything that you can do, whether it's even just with a professor, learn to pitch in the elevators. I know it sounds crazy, but the amount of arenas where I've gone in an elevator and the owner walks in the elevator is, it happens. So be ready that when you actually need it to be serious, it's, old hat. And like I said, whether it's professors or more formally at the, your university or in bigger competitions, a little known fact about Stathletes is we were graduate students at the time and had actually lost a pitch in Toronto. I know, hockey analytics, how do you lose a tech pitch in Toronto? We went down to the University of Louisville and they were like, football has a lot of data, but hockey really doesn't. I think that would work. So we got people in Kentucky where there wasn't even an arena for an hour to invest in our company, to give us money. And we didn't even have to give up equity. So it was like the best deal ever for students. And that's how we initially bankrolled our company. So thank goodness for the United States of America, or Stathletes may not be where we are today. But like I said, you don't know where that's going to come from. So apply often, pitch often, and take any sort of feedback, both good and bad, and know that you're probably somewhere in the middle.
All right, that sounds interesting. In the hockey hotbed of Louisville, Kentucky is where Stathletes was born. So we had a question for Greg about pit stops. I guess it'd be sort of like he's asking if there's a formula that calculates whether or not you should pit, sort of like a dynamic stopping model, I guess.
Yes-ish. I mean, the issue here is that, game theory, it's kind of a game theory decision. What should I do? Like, there's the absolute, if I stop and get new tires, I know how much faster I'll be for the next set of laps. But what you don't know was what I alluded to earlier. Well, so first, you're making that decision and 40 other cars are making that decision. So in game theory, when you have a 40-actor game with uncertainty, it's sort of unsolvable. So you know what you're going to do. In some situations, you can assume what others might do, but at some tracks, at some lap intervals, you don't. And again, it comes down to, so if you come out on new tires in first place because everybody behind you pitted, you're in great shape. But if you're the leader at a caution, you come in and 6 cars stay out and you come out in 7th place, your faster tires, your new tires, the speed you get from the new tires may not overcome the loss you get in the aerodynamics because you're now behind 6 cars and have lost 300 pounds of downforce. So there are guidelines, there are some templates, and it's become even more complicated because now in NASCAR, when you pit, it used to be, the first place car starts on the inside line, the second place on the outside, third place on the inside. Some tracks have an advantage to the inside versus the outside. So then they let the leader pick the inside or outside lane. Now they're letting every car pick where they, whether it's inside or outside. So if the first 3 cars take the inside lane, you may come out 4th and be the first car on the outside lane. So there are rules, there are guidelines, but it's, you don't have enough information to give you the correct answer. And some drivers are better restarting on new tires. Some drivers are much better starting on older tires, kind of in relative terms, their competitors. So yeah, it's, and there is someone asked me about Pit Row, which is the software that Richard Childress Racing uses in their war room. And they claim that it gives them the exact answer. And they did win a race last year on an off-strategy pit decision. But I would suggest that it was kind of, what Meghan alluded to, a paid commercial. They got on TV. TV loved saying, look at, NASCAR is characterized as a good old boy sport, and look at these really smart people and the computers and the simulations, and isn't this great? And they kind of implied they could do and know a lot of things that they can't really know and do as well as they think they do.
All right, so we're supposed to have a hard stop at 2:50, and I'm the one that made that rule up. So, so we're going to try to stick to it here. I would like to thank the guests. I think that this was a really interesting panel. I'm glad that I was here to be a part of it. So thank you, Greg, Meghan, and Justin, for your time today.